2025. As always, we're grateful to everyone who's joining us here today, whether you're listening live or through the archives, as we spend another couple of hours teaching and supporting people in using some of the most powerful, effective, efficient, and accessible tools I've ever encountered. These tools are available absolutely free through the tireless efforts of Dr. Michael and Jeannie Ryce on the website at whyagain.org. If you go to that website and click on the two words that say Start Here in the upper left-hand corner, it will take you to a page where you can download and read Chapter 24 of Dr. Michael Ryce's book. His book is titled, Why Is This Happening to Me Again? And that chapter of the book contains a narrative description and explanation of the primary tool in this work. That tool is called the Reality Management Worksheet, sometimes called the Reality Management Wake-Up Sheet. And it's a tool I've been using to great effect for over 20 years now to improve the quality of my life and most of my relationships, and to turn any negative emotional experience I have into part of the infallible guidance system that each and every one of us has been given. You can also download the actual worksheet process itself. It's a simple PDF file. Click the link, download it, print it off, copy it as often as you'd like, and use it over and over again absolutely free. You can also download a whole host of audio files of shows just like this one where people have been stepped through that worksheet process. And if you choose to listen to them, even repeatedly, they can serve as a powerful tutorial for you to help you get maximum benefit from these tools in the shortest amount of time possible. You can also go to your App Store and type in the three words Heartland Aramaic Forgiveness. And if you choose to do that before you're done typing the word forgiveness, you'll see the glowing heart icon. If you tap on that, it will let you download a completely free and private app that contains the Reality Management Worksheet. It contains an abbreviated version of that worksheet process, and it contains a copy of the Dragon Klingon game, which is a wonderful way to introduce these tools to even younger audiences. And we help people do all of that soon and often, primarily because it tends to improve the quality of people's lives the more they actively apply these tools in their lives. And secondarily, because it tends to prompt comments, questions, answers, and testimonials. So if you're listening to us live at live.needle.com/Dr. Michael Ryce, DrMichaelRyce. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're listening. If you would like to comment or talk to us directly, you'll need to go to your App Store and download the Needle app. It's Needl, Needle AI for live radio. And when you download that app and sign in, and then, like this show or favorite this show somehow, it will send you a ping on your phone every time someone from this studio goes live. And we welcome your comments or questions. If you have the app, you can type a comment like Susan, who typed in a good sound right off the bat today, which is good to hear. And we will ask you to type your comment in and be patient, because there are times when it doesn't let me know there's a comment there. And or raise a hand, press the phone icon, and it will let me know that you want to speak. And if we're lucky, it will alert me to the fact that you've pressed your phone icon and that you want to speak. And as I like to tell people on a regular basis, I view every comment and phone call as an additive feature to this, not an interruption. So please feel free to raise a hand or type in a comment, even if whoever's on seems to be reading something or doing a monologue. And the vast majority of shows that have been singled out as best of or highlight shows over the past 14 years are those that are the product of people like you calling in and asking a question or sending in an email. And that's another way if you want to get some comment or question or feedback from us, you can send us an email. You can email me at tjh@mindshifters-academy.org, and or you can email Jeannie at jeanie@yagain.org, WHYAGAIN.org. And if we get a comment or a question from you or feedback, we will address it on the internet show, and then as time allows, send you a notification about what day and time that occurred, so you can listen back to the archive for your feedback or input. And we greatly appreciate whenever anybody does that, because it makes it much, much easier for us to live into our intention with this work. The intention we have with this work is to be of service, and that's just a lot easier to do when we know how these things are landing for you. And we've been bouncing back and forth between reading A Course of Love with commentary and taking some comments and questions from people and talking about the themes that have come up in my caseload. And the primary theme recently, another way to look at it is the deep dive that each of us must do if we're going to get radically honest, if we're going to get fundamentally more honest with ourselves. And it is, we're living in a culture that is so externally focused, we're living in a culture that is so status and image focused, that everyone I know who's made a commitment to become more honest in their life has been shocked at how difficult it is to actually pull that off. And they're shocked to find out how many ways dishonesty and hiding things from themselves have worked their way into their life, so that it's just as common as taking a breath. And then after the fact, they step back and realize, wow, I wasn't honest there. What was it? I didn't even have any reason to be dishonest. I wasn't aware of coming from fear. I wasn't aware of feeling a need to protect myself. And yet the pattern of, like what Michael Ryce would call the 9-bit mind, or Guy Finley would call the mechanical level of mind, kicks in and just automatically fudges something or outright lies about something. And I'm sitting here wondering what that was about. Why, what part of me got activated that felt it was necessary to not tell the truth in this very moment? So I encourage you to start exploring that for yourself if you haven't, and we've talked about it a lot over the past few years, and calling with a comment or a question about whether or not you have experienced it as difficult, and whether or not you have benefited from the practice of this, what you might call, radical honesty. I've mentioned 2 different books in the past that struck me, that both of them talked about the need for deeper and deeper honesty and the difficulty achieving it. And those 2 books are one by Glennon Doyle, Untamed, by Glennon Doyle, and the other one by Laura McGowan, titled We Are the Luckiest. And so the other big theme that's come up in practice is the issue of how to say it. I suppose the best way to say it is acting from a fear belief, acting from an intense emotional state, whether it's irritation or anger or fear, because in that state, my mind tells me I know this, that, or the other thing to be right or true. And I feel, Guy Finley talks about how you never feel as solid as when you're angry. You feel very solid, you feel very real, you feel very alive when you're angry. And yet, most of us from that position are operating from a space where we believe we know what's right. And we know we're right and the people and things around us are wrong. And Guy Finley says, this is literally how we're trained in this culture, to believe that the more intense we get with our anger emotion, the more strongly we know that we're right and the people around us are wrong. And he says, my anger doesn't mean I'm right. My anger does mean that in that moment, I don't know what rightness is. We talk about this a lot. We can experience it directly. We ask people to observe this for themselves. The more intensely emotional you feel about anything, whether it's a positive emotional state that you would enjoy or an intense negative emotional state, the more intense your emotional experience, the narrower your focus of observation. We are never so narrow-minded as when we are in a rage. We are never so blind as when we are in anger or fear. The old adage says love is blind. Well, the love that we're talking about here isn't that kind of love. It isn't obsession. It isn't fascination. It isn't obsession. It is the energy of creation. It's what everything is created from and is expressing as. And the love they're talking about in the phrase love is blind has to do with obsession, fascination, a crush, being what they call in love with someone. In other words, so hyper-focused on them that that's basically all you see. That's all you think about is this person and what you're anticipating about your next meeting with them or replaying the last meeting with them. Whereas this energy of creation expressing in form as a creative force allows all things, trusts all things, embraces all things, surrenders to all things, and thereby transcends all things. So most of the time, when I have an intense emotion going, I feel like I'm right and the world around me is wrong. And what Way of Mastery calls us to on a regular basis is exactly the same thing that the Reality Management Worksheet calls us to several places on the worksheet. Cancel my need to be right. Understand how little I truly know. Put myself in a position that's subordinate to life in the moment and ask to be taught by life. And if I'm willing to do that, infinite possibilities open up and the expansion continues. As soon as I think I know something, one thing we know is that we've got brain scan studies that show that when somebody's in a questioning mode, their brain is lit up. There's a lot of activity. There's the questioning, there's the what if, there's the high level of attentiveness. And as soon as somebody decides, I know what this is, all that activity shuts down. So a brain that's in a questioning, wide open questioning state is far more highly functioning than one that's operating from a position of, I know what's going on here. I know exactly what that is. I know who that person is. I know that I'm right and they're wrong, etc. The idea of being willing to tolerate the difficult feelings we have when we step into the I don't know mind. Because we've been trained to be punished when we don't know and to be rewarded when we know. You know the right answers in school, you parrot them back to the teacher, you get a good grade. You don't get the right answer, you don't parrot it back the right way, you don't get a good grade. Your grades are bad long enough, somebody punishes you. Either the school punishes you by failing you and holding you back, or your parents punish you by withholding treats or permissions. So we've been thoroughly conditioned in our culture to only be comfortable when we think we know something, which of course leads us to make up a lot of stuff and pretend that it's the truth. And these teachings, whether it's the Course of Love or the Way of Mastery or Course in Miracles, is inviting us to open ourselves to the realization about how little we truly know, and about how the process of living in a questioning state is so much more beneficial than coming at something from a predetermined judgmental state. So remember, if you would like to make a comment or speak to us directly, you need to download the Needle app, N-E-D-L, from your app store. And we welcome comments and questions because it just makes it so much easier to know we're landing on target. We have made an attempt to turn on the microphone for Susan Bingham. Are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Welcome.
Hi, thanks. Good topic, and I have a question about the part you say we're narrowing our focus if we're extremely emotional in any direction. If we think we're right, we've also narrowed our focus. My question is, and I know this is sort of universal, I've heard about the sort of negative bias that people tend to have, some much more than others. Reading through my journals, I've come up to the year 2013, which was a really hard year for me, but not for any external reasons. I wasn't feeling well. It was finally diagnosed as a gluten intolerance, and I've mentioned this before, but being intolerant of gluten and having your body not being functioning right pushes the mind toward the negative, because everything's a struggle. You're working through this grid of uncomfortable digestion problems and so forth. But what I've noticed is, even though I'm well now, I went off wheat products years ago, and that was the ticket. It was an elimination diet, and that answered the question. But I'd been 2 or 3 years quite sick, a lot. And I'm just noticing that some of the negative bias that I think I picked up during that time is still in operation. Now, it's true that when people write in a journal, unless they're intentionally writing a gratitude journal or something, they may tend to go to a journal when they don't feel all that good. And this is true for me in spades. But it's really amazing, overwhelming to read these journals. If I read them and thought this is what my life has been, I'd think, oh my God, this hasn't been a good life at all. And that's just not true. But I didn't record the great stuff. Hi, Upland. Hey. So could you talk about negative bias? Anything you might know about that, why we do that, and what we can do about it. It seems as if that's what the tools are for, but it has to be, as you say, moment to moment, correcting that bias.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different things to say about that. I remember talking quite a bit about the book Buddha's Brain, and in that book they make some very educated guesses about their assumption about how our brains developed over time. That if the theory of evolution is correct, and we had a smaller brain at one point in time, and the frontal lobes developed a number of millions of years ago, and as they developed and they got larger, then we developed different capacities for what we call the conscious logical thought and critical thinking and stuff like that. In that process, what they talk about in that book is that it made really good sense for us to Susan, can you mute until you're ready to talk again?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how to do that, though. I'm trying to be quiet, but how do I? Oh, I see the microphone thing.
Yeah, try that. So their theory in that work is that if the traits that are adaptive get passed along from generation to generation, and the traits that are not so adaptive end up not getting passed along because the individual doesn't survive, then they talk about there's this natural selection process for us to be fearful and to be tentative, and the idea that if we guess that something is dangerous more often than we think it's joyful or easy or safe or pleasant, then we end up living more, because even if we're running away from a rabbit that can't hurt us, we're also running away from all of the animals that might hurt us. But if we're more curious and playful and less fearful, we may not run away from the rabbits, but we may not run away when we hear a noise that turns out to be a bear or some more dangerous animal and then we don't survive as often, and so we don't pass on our genetics. So they say we have a predisposition as humans to pay attention to the negatives. If I get a little, bug bite and I don't pay attention to it, then I get bitten so many times that I develop an allergy and I don't survive the anaphylactic shock. Or there's a bug bite and it gets infected and I ignore it. I get too distracted, chasing after butterflies or something, and the infection overcomes me and I don't survive. So their guess is that we have this built-in brain-centered functioning bias for the negative. And it kind of makes sense in their theory of how things get passed on for those individuals that are more fit for survival. They pass on their genetics, and those traits get amplified over time in the bloodline. The other thing they talk about is we have a built-in tendency for bias to over-predict how much satisfaction or joy or relief we're going to feel when we get what we want, when we get the good stuff. And they make sense of that by talking about if we're out in the wild and we're moving around to wherever the food sources are and they change season to season, it makes sense that I might stumble across, or my group of people, my family, my tribe, whatever, stumbles across a tree that has the most wonderfully sweet, flavorful fruit, but only at the peak of ripeness. The fruit is horribly bitter before it hits ripeness, and it's not at all savory after it's past ripe. So you've got to be at that tree at just the right time to be able to ingest all of this the flesh of the fruit and pack on all the calories so you can survive the winter. And then, of course, you can't stay there all winter long because it's out in the open, it's in a field or whatever, and you got to find shelter. And so these nomadic peoples developed this ability to remember, where was that tree, and get me back here at the same time next year so that I can load up on that fruit, so I pack on the pounds so I can survive more. And so what happens is we stumble across the tree and we start gorging on the fruit. And of course, we haven't had any in a year, and we've been dreaming about how good the fruit was, and that's what brought us back to the tree. But after about 3 or 4 fruits, that's enough. But now we have to keep eating because we need all the sugar. So it doesn't even taste good anymore. We're just eating the same thing over and over again. We don't have anywhere near the pleasure we thought we would have from having a whole tree full of fruit, but we need to eat it to survive. So there's a phrase they say, the shine wears off the rose pretty quick. After about 8 or 10 of those fruits, I don't care if I eat any more for the next year, but I got to keep eating because I need the calories, I need the pounds. When I leave the tree, good riddance. I'm overstuffed. It's like, if I eat to the point of getting sick with something, I may never want to eat that thing again. But then as I get hungrier through the winter and I start having fond memories of the delicious ripe fruit, and that's the motivation to bring me back. So we have biases that might have been built into the way our brains function for both over predicting how much joy or satisfaction we're going to get from acquiring something, and a bias for over predicting the negative, which translates into safety for a lot of people. And then, of course, we've got the judgments and what the Way of Mastery calls the trivialities that have been programmed into our intellect, like garbage shoved in a garbage can. And those come from our culture and our family. And we are blind to most of those. We assume this is just the truth. Everybody knows X, Y, and Z type person isn't reliable. We know, men are this and women are that. We know democracies are better than every other form of judgment, and we don't even question it. And those biases operate on a regular basis. The other thing I would mention, because Susan was talking about being sick and how there's a tendency for being in discomfort, pain, or sickness to really narrow our field of view, really change our focus down to something myopic. And I understand that that is a natural tendency. It is not ironclad, though. We can learn to just observe the sensations, and instead of labeling them as, torturous pain or misery or I'm so sick, we observe, I'm having this experience. And we have people, and our life experience, if we keep our eyes open to it, we have many, many examples of people who function at a very high level when they're sick. We've got, sports figures that go out and play in a championship game, and they're basically out of their minds. They're just in the zone, and they play some of their best games because they're not focusing on the symptoms. They're focusing on something else. Or they're noticing the symptoms, and they're taking whatever remedies they can to help the body process through whatever it needs to process through, and then they stay active. And this is a part of the natural childbirth movement back in the 70s. They started talking to people about breathing and interpreting these sensations in your body as sensations rather than labeling them as pain or agony. And it kind of some people believed it was akin to a self-hypnosis, that people just talked themselves into the fact that the cramps weren't really painful, they were just a sensation. And with us, that kind of self-hypnosis, they took a whole different experience from that process than those who labeled it as pain and would be screaming out for pain meds and all of that. So even when we're sick, I see this on a regular basis in my caseload, people get a cold or a flu or a sinus infection, and their whole sense of perspective of time and the future collapses. And they start to think, I'll never get healthy. And they're only like 2 days into the symptoms. But they can't see into the future. They can't remember, oh, I've been sick before and I've bounced back after a week or so or whatever. And so if those very people get introduced to just watching their thoughts and shifting them, they start to experience their colds, their flu, their, what Michael Ryce would call their healing crisis. They're moving through the energies as they leave and experiencing these symptoms very, very differently based on how they label them, based on the meaning they give them. So, I have done a lot of work with people over the years who've had a negative bias in one way or another. They have a negative belief about, a judgment about, and with the observation, with coaching them about their ability to shift the focus of their thoughts, with practice, with things like Michael Ryce's tool of word links, with conditioning my mind to respond differently, to one thought being connected to another, I can make a lot of progress in terms of my biases if I can become aware of them. So, does that address your question in part, Susan Bingham?
My mind, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I had to find the mute button. The fact that it goes both ways, you mentioned physical. I've always admired someone who didn't have any arms and yet they raised a baby, or that's one situation, but that isn't a situation of pain exactly. That's just inconvenience, a limitation. Whereas if you have a bellyache and you're going to throw up, you're really not good for much for a while. In my opinion, I don't think if I was staying in that sick stomach zone for days and days without, being able to eat, but everything that went down sideways somehow and didn't feel good. And there were lots of other things. I'm not trying to defend. It's just that some kinds of pain are worse than others. That's one thing I was thinking. The other is there's even it's midrash, Christian midrash. They say Mary felt pain in childbirth, but she did not suffer. And you do exactly that when you are using the tools. You talk about observing, maybe even detaching. You're there, you feel it, but you're not suffering. And I wonder if that's what animals are like. They may be trapped in one of these leg things that bites if you're a wild animal and you've stepped into some kind of trap. That's terrible pain. And we can't tell whether they're suffering or not, but they certainly are feeling a lot of pain. So what I'm doing is just doing a blunderbuss response to several things you said. But the coolest thing is the business of positive bias, positive outlook. Some people they laugh a lot more than others, and their life situation might be terrible, but they have the capacity to step away from that, maybe have a friend over, and they get to laughing about things. Whereas in my situation, I was noticing how hard it was to enjoy anything because I had this negative bias, sort of like a blanket over everything, at least as I was recording things in this journal. So, boy, we've got a lot going on.
Well, so one of the things that I would say there is, you said, and their life might be terrible, And in order to speak about that accurately, I would need to say their life might look like something I would label terrible.
Yeah.
And they may not be labeling it terrible. So they may not experience it as intensely negatively as I believe I would.
Yeah.
You know, one of
Good
the more
point.
powerful presentations by Abraham Hicks on this point had to do with that very thing. Somebody was wearing a red hat, pulled down over his baseball cap, and didn't want to be seen, and he went on this tirade about all the misery in the world and how horrible it is, and basically pushing back on most of the things that Abraham talks about. And one of the parts of the response from Abraham was the people that are going through that stuff, whether it's, you know, there's starvation level food problems or, you know, having to relocate or whatever, many of them are not suffering as much as you believe you would be suffering if it happened to you. Because they're on the ground,
About
they're
that
in the
with
middle
the
of
refugees
it,
all the
and they're
time.
coping with it. And they're coping with it. And to them it's just, okay, what's the next thing to do?
Yeah.
Whereas somebody looking at that from the outside, from the comfort of their nice warm home and their nice job and plenty of food or whatever, might imagine, oh my God, woe is me. I would never be able to survive that. That's torturous, etc. Just adding to the observation that we are the ones that create our experience. And we create whether we're going to generate suffering or we're going to generate allowance and surrender, or we're going to generate joy. So that's what I wanted to say about that. To just say, you know, if you say their lives are miserable, what you're saying is their lives look like if I was living it, I would feel miserable.
Yeah.
And while they may be going through some disruption and discomfort, they may not be having anywhere near the negative interpretation of it that you are from the outside.
I wonder if that isn't what all of us do when we look at the newspaper and we see pictures in Gaza and Sudan, or we read about or know about refugees who are looking for a place to live and very insecure with food and money, and I imagine that they are suffering the way I would out there, and so it's very hard to look at the newspaper, so I kind of turn away and pretend it's not really happening. That's not so great either. So this is just a fun.
But what are you going to do about it?
Right.
What do you have some control over? I mean, this is what I keep bringing people back to in my work, whether it's in my individual caseload or on this internet show or in the support groups. When you say you turn a blind eye to it, well, it's not necessarily a blind eye, but if it's happening across the world, and I don't have, you know, billions of dollars to mobilize, you know, delivery of whatever they need, whether it's firefighting equipment or food or housing, then what am I going to do if I sit here thousands of miles away and focus on that and generate sadness, fear, anger, hurt, confusion? What am I adding to the soup that we call this quantum soup, the energy field, if that's what I do with my mind energy?
That is such a great question, and we've talked about this before. I have thought that if I worry about someone, I'm actually helping. I'm doing my part. I'm noticing, and I'm suffering along with them, and that is a good thing. That's just crazy thinking, but it's also a kind of, this is how I interpret it, it's a kind of paying homage. It's a kind of respect for what they're going through. It's not blowing it off. And you're saying neither one is right. neither one is necessary.
Well, it's not about right or wrong. It's just about, can I step into observing what's the impact? And for my money, especially over the last 20 years or so, I have found it's far more beneficial for me and the people around me and the people I love and care about, for me to generate more loving energy within myself and then extend it out.
Yeah.
And so if I have somebody that's, hundreds or thousands of miles away and they're going through something that I would think would be very difficult or challenging or, painful or whatever, I might have some financial resources and find a way to donate to a charity to get money to them to help them. I might also sit down right where I am, notice that I'm getting myself all feeling tight and tense and worried and anxious and fearful and sad, and decide instead to step into a practice like Pierre Pradervan's Gentle Art of Blessing.
Yeah.
Or to do some EFT tapping on myself to calm myself down. And then if I get calm enough, I might pull out a Reality Management Worksheet and start laying out in the worksheet process, what is the emotion I'm feeling? What are the thoughts I'm using to create that emotion? What's the dynamic going on in the world that I think I've labeled with these thoughts that create that emotion? And what's my mind telling me is the right thing that should be happening or needs to happen for this to get rectified? So I figure out the goal. Then I cancel the thought, I cancel the goal, and I ask to be shown another way to look at this same situation, this same data points. And my experience, my boots on the ground experience in life is that is a highly preferable way to approach, and I greatly prefer the outcomes in my life experience when I choose that over getting angry, getting overwhelmed with grief, getting myself all wrought up with trying to figure it out and getting confused. And it's not about what's right or wrong, it's about which do you prefer. If you've been exposed to this possibility that you don't have to get sad and depressed and angry about news that you think is less than positive or loving, and you can choose a different application of your own mind energy, try it and see if you prefer that. See if you prefer the outcomes that unfold.
By
your
saying
mind energy focused on loving, compassionate energy or sending them blessing. Go ahead.
Yeah. You've made me realize that in a way what you're saying is you're giving us permission not to get bent out of shape. And why do we get bent out of shape? I know I do, partly because I want to think of myself as a loving and nice person, a caring person. And if I feel a lot of painful things for these people, that means I'm a loving person. Well, that's a pile of bullshit, and I can let that go. That's a nice thought, Dr. Tim. I could still be a good person and do the Pradervan stuff and say prayers and send money, but not get bent out of shape.
Yeah, well, if it's an option and you can experiment with it, try it for a while, getting yourself all bent out of shape, and try it for a while using your mind energy in a loving way, and see which one you prefer. And then you're doing what Way of Mastery calls us to, which is waking up to the realization that you don't experience anything other than the effects of your own choices. The life events are going to happen, and yet your experience of them is a result of how you choose to interpret and respond to those life events.
Yeah.
And we know that. We've talked about it. We've got people like Roger McGowan. We've got people like Nelson Mandela. We've got people like, the man they called Wild Bill from the concentration camps in World War II. We know people who've been in very intensely painful and restrictive situations who have chosen for love over fear. and either shared their story or written about it in a book, or they've been observed by others and those people have written about it. So it's possible in some of the most challenging circumstances to still make the choice for love and compassion and joy. You know, I frequently suggest to people in comments I'm writing in texts or emails, you know, choose joy soon and often. It's a choice. You know, the core of this work that Dr. Michael Ryce and Jeannie make available in these tools is the recognition that I am the author of my emotions. Every emotion that arises within me is a creation of where I'm focusing my mind energy.
Mm.
And if I don't like the creation that I'm producing, once I've been awakened to this observation that that's what's causing it, I have the liberty then to choose differently.
Which is a way of claiming agency for yourself. Even I was going to argue with you and say I can't choose joy. It just seems as if that's not in my nature. And you're saying that's not true. But it means taking a responsibility and really changing thoughts, thought patterns, intentions, everything.
Yeah, well, one of the more recent the podcast that I've recommended a number of times is called "We Can Do Hard Things" with Glennon Doyle and her wife Abby and her sister, and fairly recently, it's probably 3 or 4 back now from the one they released today, but fairly recently they had a podcast with Martha Beck again. They've had her a number of times in the past.
Oh, yeah.
And on this one, they're talking about, for each person, they do a little work with Martha Beck on their anxiety. And she helps them ask the right kinds of questions to end up dismantling most of their anxiety. And it's I recommend the podcast as a listen, but that specific episode in the podcast, the most recent one was Martha Beck, she talks about how they've got some research that she's in the middle of doing. They've known for a long time that when people are in a high level of anxiety, it collapses their creativity. So Martha decided, well, what happens if we create the exercises that usher people into a creative state, and we use getting their mind into a creative state as an antidote to anxiety? Will it actually suppress anxiety or eliminate it? And they're finding over and over again that works. So that was one of the root pieces that she was building on as she used the Byron Katie type questioning with each of the 3 women to help dismantle the thing that they're most afraid of or have the highest anxiety about.
Yeah.
And for those that aren't aware, the Byron Katie process that she calls the work is a series of 4 questions with turnarounds. And the questions are, because Byron Katie has observed that she only suffers when she believes her negative thoughts. She has all kinds of negative thoughts that don't cause suffering because she just observes that they're just thoughts, and she doesn't believe them, and she doesn't pour a lot of mind energy into them, and so they pass.
Yeah.
But when she grabs a hold of a negative thought and she chooses to believe it, and she starts pouring her mind energy into it, she generates suffering. So her questions are, number 1, when I have a negative thought and it's generating suffering, I question, can I know this is true? whether you say yes or no, just take some time to genuinely ask, can I know this is true? And the second question is, can I absolutely, beyond any shadow of a doubt, know this is true?
Mm-hmm.
And so for some people, right off the bat, they say, no, I can't know this is true. And others, they say, yes, I know this is true. And then
Yeah.
they get to the second question, and many people who said, yes, I know this is true, when they're asked, can you absolutely, beyond any shadow of a doubt, know this is true? Many people say, well, no, not if you put it that way.
Mm.
But even if people say, yes, absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, just say yes. This is just an exercise of observing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next question is, how does it feel in your life when you believe this negative thought is true?
Yeah.
And just really talk about what are the consequences, the consequential energies flowing from your belief that this negative thing is true. And then the fourth question is, what would your life feel like if you didn't believe this was true?
Mm.
And let yourself experience what that would be like and talk about that and flesh that out. And then, of course, she has the turnarounds, which help you dig into it even more, saying, well, what if the opposite of this negative thought is true? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mm-hmm.
in the questioning process, again, we aren't knowing. We aren't, I know I'm right and everybody else is wrong. We're in the state of awe,
Mm-hmm.
questioning, wide open, childlike curiosity. And that's what Way of Mastery calls us to over and over again.
Yeah.
For good reason, because the people who've worked with Way of Mastery find they like the results better.
Yeah.
And if you like the results of something you're doing, please feel free to keep doing it. If you don't like it, please feel free to try something else. Bottom line observation number 1. Okay, so Celinda in a text or a comment says, I have a couple of thoughts to share. Don't know if I can call or not. I don't know how to help you understand if you can call or not. If you have the app, it's a matter of tapping the phone receiver icon, Celinda. So feel free. Or type your comment in, and if we're lucky, it'll show up for me to read it. Other thoughts from you, Susan?
No, not at the moment. Just thinking about all that you've been saying. Rewiring the brain.
Well, and one of the most fruitful rewirings of the brain that I've done over the past 20 or so years is this canceling my need to be right and asking to be shown. So putting myself in a position subordinate to life and the flow of life itself and asking to be shown something that I can't see when I'm myopically focused on how I'm right and you're wrong and it's settled, so why argue?
Yeah. That phenomenon is very operant right now with such a divided country. We just don't want to hear the other side. We don't want to change what we think we know is right so often. Yeah.
Well, again, this when you're talking about the country and the divided country and the global issues, my preference is to invite you to come back to yourself. What do you do when you notice that? What can you do to shift the emotional states you're generating in the moment?
Good.
And what can you do to shift the focus of your energy over to the few things in this life that you might have direct control over?
Yeah.
And use that to the best of your ability to make your life and the lives of those immediately around you better whenever possible.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's happened with Celinda. I don't see anything else in the comments, and no one's raised a hand to be another caller. So
Dr. Tim, did you ever hear from Christian Sundberg?
not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
I have it on my calendar to do a follow-up email next week if I don't hear from him.
And that podcast you just did sounded like something a friend of mine needs. She has a 27-year-old daughter still living at home with a very hard diagnosis and behavior problems. Very bright young woman who swings into these absolutely destructive, attacking moods. And she definitely would benefit from being with her friends and family, but yet the family needs some kind of protection and help with her, and they don't have much money at all to do anything fancy. But I'm hoping that's what your podcast did address, other options besides just putting someone in a hospital somewhere.
Well, and this particular endeavor is called Ellenhorn, ELLENHORN, all one word, .com. And if you go there, they've got 3 different facilities in 3 different cities, and explore that. And I don't have any idea about cost and who pays for it, or if insurance pays for it or whatever. But but there are some really good people coming up with solutions that are more humanistically focused. They're not treating a disease, they're not treating a diagnosis, they're working with a person to help him or her function at a higher level,
right,
and resolve difficulties they may be experiencing, and do it to whatever degree possible where they live, in their work, in their school, in their community, in their family, etc.
Yeah, ellenhorn.org.
Yeah,
you said.
or .com, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Ross Ellenhorn and ellenhorn.com.
All right, thanks.
And that podcast, with any luck, will publish a week from Tuesday on the On Your Mind podcast from Journey's Dream, or journeystream.org/podcast.
Right.
All right, well, I do not have a comment or a hand raised from Celinda, and we're down to our last minute, so I will thank you, Susan Bingham, and as always, appreciate your call and your comments and questions. I will remind us all that we come from love. We're made of the stuff we call love. We actually are love, and everything else is false. I'll end this show, invite you back tomorrow, and invite you to turn the app back on soon when Michael and Jeannie start their second hour. Blessings.